Hi, everyone. This is the lecture on gentrification. I want to make sure that you have a clear understanding of what it is from a historical standpoint and how it impacts communities. In particular, you should understand both the class and racial dimensions related to gentrification, especially how it's played out here in Sacramento. The roots of gentrification. This term is usually traces back to London in the 1950s and 60s. And they used it to describe the influx of new gentry or those people with money into low income neighborhoods. Similar to what we see today, the gentry essentially displaced individuals, forcing them to move into other areas and other neighborhoods. According to the Brookings Institute, gentrification is the process by which higher income households display low income residents of a neighborhood, changing the central character of that neighborhood. And so when we talk about the displacement, this can mean people being forced to move. This can mean changing what businesses are available. That certain types of businesses may be forced to move out. For example, the mom and pop shops or kind of community establishments that had been there for 20, 30, 40 years. All of these are things that you probably witness on a day to day basis in your communities here in Sacramento. Gentrification in the US is often attached to social class mobility. So, social class mobility is the movement of individuals, families, households, or groups of people within or between socioeconomic class categories in a society. Mobility can either be upward, in which you go from a lower kind of class status or class category to a higher one, so that's upward mobility. Or we could also have downward mobility, in which people fall from or move farther down the um, the socioeconomic class structure from where they were. Oftentimes, when we own property or buy property, increases wealth, which therefore improves one's socioeconomic status. There are three dimensions of gentrification. Number one is the displacement of lower income residents, which I've already talked about. Two is the physical transformation of the neighborhood, mostly through the upgrading of its housing stock and commercial spaces. So, what this usually means, or what we often see, is them knocking down old buildings or old factories, old apartment buildings, or even old houses, and building whole new condos or apartments or housing in its place. It could also be, in some cases and in some cities, for those who choose to want to retain the sort of historic value of a house, basically the remodeling of these houses that have oftentimes, over time, need become in need of some work. And then third, the changing cultural character of the neighborhood. This could mean changes in businesses, as I've noted, the moving out of particular populations, often ethnic populations, and all the businesses associated with them. This could also include removal of things like arts and artists' work, like murals, art pieces, public art. We've seen the erasure of particular murals and things like that here in Sacramento. But culture means all forms of it. It could also be the change in the ways in which people act and interact with each other as well. More recently, the term gentrification has been used more broadly to include any neighborhood that is becoming less affordable to current residents, regardless of the history of the neighborhood or the outcomes for residents. This most recent usage, however, obscures the process underlying neighborhood change and minimizes the impact on non-white racial and ethnic groups and the histories of systematic disinvestment. So, in many ways, we talk about this as just a class dynamic, as something that is about how much money you make, how much can you afford to pay, but actually don't look at, in a sort of systematic ways, the groups of people who are impacted by this. In the United States, gentrification has most often been applied to describe changes happening in declining areas characterized by poor physical conditions, concentrated poverty, and the racial segregation of people of color. As some of you have already indicated, we've seen this in places like Oak Park, and we're witnessing it in terms of its current transformation. But gentrification is complex. And it's important to understand there are three key things that you need to consider when you're thinking about this. And I'm going to ask you to consider these three dimensions as you think about the reading that you've done and the videos you're watching regarding gentrification. Number one, the historic conditions, especially policies and practices that make communities susceptible to gentrification. The way in which central city disinvestment and investment patterns are taking place today as a result of these conditions. And third, the way that gentrification impacts communities. And I'm going to expand on this a little bit more as it relates to Sacramento, specifically, as well as things that have been happening more generally. This is a map of Sacramento, and these are taken from the Sacramento Gentrification Project. Using data from the U.S. Census, this first map that you're going to see on this page, it looks at the change from 1990 to 2000. And in particular, they are pointing out where we saw gentrification in the 10 years between 1990 and 2000. As you can see there, it was only really a small part of Sacramento, right? However, this has changed dramatically, as a lot of us have talked about in class, in more recent memory. Now, what's important to note about this map, this is much more current and looks at the change between 2000 and actually 2013. So note that it's actually that we're looking at data that's about 5 or 6 years old. It's oftentimes really hard to get the census level data that's because it's not produced every year. So know that gentrification has probably actually increased even more. So I drew an arrow there to indicate where Sacramento City College is, just to kind of as a reference point. And as many of you have already talked about in class, and we sort of were joking about this, but jokingly talking about this, that if we went north of campus and we hit Broadway and went left or right, we would see gentrification everywhere. Those blue areas that we see, right, in blue, that are relatively close to Sacramento City College, represents that whole Broadway corridor. Up what people are now calling Upperland Park. It also, if you look kind of closely, the 99 freeway goes through the area, and we know the area east of the 99 freeway is Oak Park, where we've seen huge amounts of transformation, and you're actually going to be doing a specific reading on the transformation of Oak Park. As some of you have also talked about, we're seeing a lot of changes also in North Sacramento, in Del Paso Heights. But we're also seeing it south of Land Park, and that other blue area, that's South Land Park. And most notably, I would tell you that I think that if you looked at the area just south of campus, I would also include the changes to Hollywood Park and the Pocket that have not necessarily seen too much, right? So remember, the dark blue areas on this map are tracts that have been gentrified. And the areas in sort of the grayish areas did not gentrify, meaning that you didn't necessarily see an socioeconomic change in that region. In the more beige areas, they said were not eligible, meaning the data, we weren't able to sort of track data in that area. Now, when you watch the video on the history of redlining in Sacramento, it highlights many of the three principles needed to understand gentrification here. And I want you to make sure that you're paying close attention to that. Some of the policies that I think are important to note. Number one is redlining, which I think I've discussed before. This is the discriminatory practice of drawing a red line indicating where banks would avoid investments based on community demographics. Historically, it was most frequently used to discriminate against black inner-city neighborhoods throughout the United States. In Sacramento, it was definitely African-American populations, but also Latinos and Asian Americans as well. They also talk about the history of racial restrictive covenants in Sacramento. These are agreements entered into by a group of property owners, subdivision developers, or real estate operators in a given neighborhood, binding them not to sell, lease, rent, or otherwise convoy their property to specified groups because of race, creed, or color for a definite period unless all agreed to the transaction. Now, keep in mind, all of the different stakeholders are people who would have to agree to change that. So in other words, when these were, until these were outlawed, these agreements were highly popular and really reshaped Sacramento. The owner was legally prohibited from selling to members of the specific minority group or groups listed in the covenant and could be sued or held financially liable. Urban renewal, Other housing and transportation policies in the mid 20th century fueled the growth of mostly white suburbs and the exodus of capital from urban centers. This was something that we often hear referred to as white flight. This was really something that we saw happen largely between the 70s, 80s, and maybe even the early 90s. But also, as indicated in a couple of the different movies that you've had to watch for this class, this white flight happened as early as the 1940s and 50s. For example, we could look at the GI Bill as an example, and that this program guaranteed low-cost mortgage loans for returning World War II soldiers, but discrimination limited the extent to which black veterans were able to purchase homes in the growing suburbs. The FHA largely required that suburban developers agree to not sell houses to black people in order for the developers to access these guaranteed loans. So here is another example of what we call institutional discrimination, right, or institutional racism. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But these policies, both at national levels and community levels, really changed the complexion of neighborhoods and changed the ways in which we saw investment and disinvestment happening. So as we saw this idea of white flight occurring and people moving out of centers and the lack of capital, we saw a disinvestment from central cities. Often talked about as urban renewal, this left behind in central city neighborhoods low-income households and communities of color who bore the brunt of the highway system expansion and urban renewal programs. So for example, if you look at the 5 freeway or the 99 freeway here in Sacramento, historically, we know that the very specific low-income communities were pushed out or lost their property because of eminent domain. This resulted in the mass clearance of homes, businesses, and neighborhood institutions, and set the stage for widespread public and private disinvestment in the decades that followed. The foreclosure crisis in more recent history also contributed to making places vulnerable to gentrification. So in low-income communities of color, we saw disproportionate levels of subprime lending, resulting in mass foreclosures, leaving those neighborhoods vulnerable to investors seeking to purchase and flip homes. Today, both people and capital are flooding back into these historically disinvested neighborhoods. So why? Well, relative affordability. In many U.S. cities, the rental market has gotten increasingly expensive, and even moderate income earners are on the hunt for lower housing costs. Older historic housing stock that appeals to new residents, being able to have a larger home that you could renovate and make your own, but also close proximity to city centers where jobs, restaurants, and art spaces are increasingly locating. And then revitalization. Cities are investing in some of these neighborhoods with improved transit access and infrastructure, in part to draw in newcomers. So what you saw was the mass exodus of capital, leaving behind particular communities and groups. And then as we saw the reinvestment, the people who were left behind are now being pushed out of those same neighborhoods. This has had a very specific community impact. So while increasing investment in an area can be positive, gentrification is also often associated with displacement. So displacement is the forced movement of long-term residents from communities because they are no longer able to afford to live in that neighborhood because of increased cost of living, including rent and housing prices. This is largely economic displacement. It's important to note that there's also been cultural displacement. Even for long-time residents who are able to stay in newly gentrifying areas, changes in the makeup and character of a neighborhood can lead to the reduced sense of belonging or feeling out of place in one's own home. So as you are doing your reading and as you are doing the watching of videos for this, I would like you to be able to make sure that you're able to answer the following questions. What is gentrification and who does it impact? What are examples of the dimensions of gentrification here in Sacramento? And what are examples of economic and cultural displacement here in Sacramento?